So in April of 2007, several days of unrest broke out here in Tallinn, the otherwise fairly sleepy capital city of Estonia. And the reason for that unrest and the riots that ensued, well, it was basically this guy behind me, the Bronze Soldier. And the Bronze Soldier, as you might be able to tell, is really a visual representation of the Soviet Red Army. That same Red Army that broke the back of fascism in Europe by the spring of 1945. And actually in Estonia, well, it was liberated by 1944. The thing is, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new Estonian authorities set out on a path of decommunization. And they started to refer to really the twin dictatorships of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And in 2007, a decision was taken, very controversially, to move the Bronze Soldier here to a rather sleepy cemetery, a little bit difficult to find. So, in 2012, the Estonian authorities went one step further and they passed something which gets referred to often as the Valentine's Day Law, which effectively sets out honoring, celebrating, marking as national heroes those who fought against Soviet occupation. Now, the law is very ambiguous in a sense because what it tries to do again is to refer to the Nazi and Soviet occupations on equal terms. But by basically granting the status of a national hero to anybody who fought against the Red Army and the partisans, well, that means the Estonian Legion, that means the Waffen SS. So, one thing that I think is worth talking about in quite a lot of detail is this notion that Soviet Estonia, or the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, was merely a period of Soviet occupation, or even Russian occupation. And I think it's worth going back to, well, not the beginning, but basically as far back as the dissolution of the Russian Empire in 1917. Because with those two revolutions that broke out in the Russian Empire, the second one in particular, the Bolshevik Revolution, gives oppressed nations the right to self-determination. So, for example, my country of Finland is actually granted its independence as a consequence of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's policy. So a very progressive policy that aimed to basically go against, decades and centuries of great Russian chauvinism. And the thing is, look, you ended up with all of these new independent republics as a consequence, like Estonia or Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, the Caucasus. But it has to be said, well, these new republics, there was still class struggle ongoing. It wasn't necessarily a settled question of which kind of regime would win out. So in Estonia, you had a clash between the Reds and the Whites, as you did in Finland as well. And the Whites, interestingly, the capitalists, you can say, they always basically said, we are the ones defending national self-determination and sovereignty. The interesting thing is, they weren't really that sovereign at all. I mean, they relied very much on the imperialist powers, in particular Britain. So, for example, Estonia, the new government, ends up basically being one which is used as a launching pad by the British for encircling Soviet power, the new Soviet Russia. And it's kind of ironic. I mean, the jokes really write themselves. You have somebody like Winston Churchill, one of the most despicable human beings of the 20th century in terms of his racism and love of colonialism, actually talking about the need to, number one, strangle the Bolshevik baby in its cradle, but in addition to this, being somebody who talks about upholding the right, the necessity of Estonia to its national sovereignty and independence. I mean, come on. It wasn't really about independence, it was about the material and geostrategic benefits for British imperialism in this part of the world. So by 1920, a peace was concluded between the independent Estonian government and Soviet Russia. It wasn't at that time yet the Soviet Union. And the peace held. The thing is, by the 1930s, though, you had the development in a very serious way of fascism, capitalism in profound crisis, the ripping up of bourgeois democratic norms. And this, of course, was spearheaded by Mussolini in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. And Hitler made made it very obvious. He said our principal enemy is international Jewish Bolshevism, international communism. And a lot of the Western powers, as a consequence, were quite enthusiastic. I mean, doing business deals, of course, with Nazi Germany, and also Churchill, that grade A piece of shit, once more basically saying, hey, you know, this is somebody who, you know, I very much admire. So eventually, the Soviet Union tries to enter into an anti-fascist pact with France and with Great Britain, and they're not interested. So ultimately, they sign a non-aggression pact, the USSR does, with Nazi Germany as a means to buy them some time. And eventually, this is very, very significant to the strengthening of the frontier. Red Army troops will move into Estonia as a consequence of the necessity of combating fascism. And the class struggle resumed as well. Those Bolsheviks basically also rose up in Estonia, and Soviet power was established. Basically, Nazi Germany will invade, of course, in 1941. 1944, Soviet power is reestablished. And from that point forward, once more, the fundamental sort of, well, I guess you can say, setup for fascism is undercut. You know, the large land holdings are broken up, businesses are nationalized, there can be no return to a fascist way of life as a consequence, but that's what they call, ultimately, Soviet occupation. Well, you know, we can't spend all of our time in military cemeteries. We gotta look for some old Leninist landmarks like this. The Hotel Olympia, now taken over by Radisson. But yeah, it would have been called the Hotel Olympia because the Olympics took place in the Soviet Union in 1980. They, of course, largely took place in Moscow, but the sailing events took place here in Tallinn, so Estonia was also represented at that time. Oh my goodness. Can you see the hammer and the sickle up there? Wow. The House of Culture here in Tallinn. Oh man, this has just ignited all of my socialist senses. We have a memorial to the events of 1905, the dry run for the Russian Revolution, or revolutions of 1917. Well, it's this Stalinian marvel that I've been trekking to see. The Soprus cinema dating back to 1955. Well, let's go inspect the side of the Soprus. Still in business, as you can see. Kino Soprus. Well, it's looking a little bit derelict, a little bit run down, a little bit dilapidated. I suppose that all means exactly the same thing. But this is the former Vladimir Ilyich Lenin Palace of Culture and Sports. Otherwise, in later years, i.e., well, Estonian independence years, known as the Linnahalle, or the Town Hall. So basically, it was constructed for those 1980 Olympic Games. I guess this is all cordoned off. Can we get up in here? Oh man, made it to the top and it appears to be worth it. Look at this. Oh man, yeah, you could just imagine what this place would have been like 44 years ago, almost to the day, because the Olympics are happening now as well in 2024 in Paris. But yeah, if you've ever actually watched that opening ceremony from the 1980 Moscow Olympics, you'll know that one thing that it really does well, or that they did well, was to try to represent all of the hundreds of nationalities that made up the rich cultural fabric of the Union. And especially represented were the Union republics. And Estonia was a full Union republic. I mean, that's one reason why it's very difficult to refer to this period for me as a Soviet occupation. Well, how could we come to Tallinn without staying at a quintessentially Soviet hotel? And that's exactly where I've been posted up, at the Hotel Viru, which was the first high-rise building in Tallinn, period. It actually opened back in 1972. It was constructed between 1969 and then by two Finnish companies. You know, I would say by far the most interesting facet of this hotel is the fact that about 60 of the rooms would have been bugged back in the day by the KGB. And the KGB, well, they had a listening outpost on the 23rd floor, which was actually only discovered after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Wow, what a view of the old town from up here on the 19th floor. And yeah, the hotel used to be run by the Soviet tourism agency Intourist, same as, well, the Hotel Kazakhstan and the Hotel Uzbekistan, which we stayed in earlier this year. And a lot of similarities, I would say, just in terms of the architectural style. As soon as I basically came up to my floor yesterday, I felt like I was back in Almaty or Tashkent. And here you have it, the Monument to the War of Independence. And just reading the information board here, it talks about an attack from Soviet Russia that the independent Estonian state was fending off. Again, we've already discussed this. In reality, what you had was a class struggle, you had a civil war in effect, and of course the revolutionaries were aided by their, well, compatriots and fellow socialists, comrades from across the now de facto border. But interesting how this all gets skewed to basically present this notion of independence, but I suppose every national state, it needs a founding myth. And you know, of course, it pays reference and tribute to the naval forces of Great Britain and also the assistance provided by the United States of America and France. Because, yeah, of course, the countries that plundered the world, they really cared about national independence here in this former part of the Russian Empire, obviously. You know, some things just never change. I mean, today you have the United States of America supporting the independence of Ukraine. And this is the same United States of America that is facilitating the mass slaughter of the Palestinian people. Couldn't care less about their demands for independence and sovereignty and self-determination. And also, I mean, did you forget about the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan? A country that is perpetually at war, invading, occupying other countries? I mean, come on, man. Alright, so been walking along the waterfront for the last hour or so from the city center. Absolutely stunning, by the way, today. And we're here at the Maarjamäe Memorial Complex. It's a series of memorials, and the one that we're looking for is actually condemned by the current Estonian authorities, but it's still supposed to be one that you can visit. And as you can probably imagine, well, it basically pays tribute to the Red Army soldiers from World War II, here known otherwise as occupiers. Oh man, yeah, they ain't trying to preserve this. Not at all. Well, you can see that it's actually fenced off in certain places, although it looks like it's very easily accessible. We'll just burst through the fences ourselves. But yeah, over here, for example, these hands would have been kept warm for years, decades, by the presence of an eternal flame. Now, of course, long gone. What's dangerous? The revival of fascism in Europe? Well, this has been quite nicely defaced with the flag of independent, quote unquote. Not very independent at all, is it? Completely contingent on NATO, but the independent state, allegedly, of Ukraine, with, of course, a slogan next to it. You know the slogan? I wonder if the person knows that it was actually popularized by the Bandera formations during the Second World War. You know, they clearly don't want us to hop over here past the fence and up the stairs, but I really don't give a fuck what these motherfuckers have to say, so let's do it, man. Condemned, condemned, condemned. We are fucking fucked. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, no question, if we keep on this trajectory. What else do we have here? Nothing substantial. Well, Yeah, it reminds me, and I guess this is the only way to conclude, of a very famous quote from the one and only Marshal Zhukov, who found his way into Berlin in May of 1945. And what he said was, "We have liberated Europe from fascism, but they will never forgive us for it."